Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 12th episode of 2023. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor for Fiber for Breakfast, and our gold sponsors, Nokia and Vetro. On next Wednesday, the 29th, the Fiber Broadband Association will be hosting Fiber Day on the Hill in Washington, D.C. in the Rayburn building. Our goal is to set the record straight and educate members of Congress and their staff on the capabilities, performance, and necessity of fiber to close the digital equity gap for generations to come. This event is going to feature 5 interactive demonstration stations presented by the FBA members that show that fiber is and how it improves U.S. households, communities, and the economy, including facilitating 5G, precision agriculture, education, healthcare, and the economic opportunities. Also, our next regional Fiber Connect workshop and Train the Trainer class will be in Oklahoma City on April 6th. These workshops have been incredibly popular, so please register today. I just found out last night that our hotel is now sold out, and so we're working on identifying some additional nearby hotels. So please register. And then also, registration is now open for our regional Fiber Connect workshop in Austin, Texas on May 16th. Again, these workshops and hotels sell out really quickly, so please register early. That brings us to today's Fiber for Breakfast session with our good friend Jeff Heynen of Dell'Oro to discuss fiber history in the making based on his most recent research. But before I formally introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehlers from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us this morning. Before I go over a few logistical items, we'd like to once again thank the platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco, and our gold sponsors, Nokia and Vetro. Now, if everyone would just keep in mind that you're all in listen mode only. To ask a question, you can simply type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. This presentation is being recorded and will be available to members and everyone else on our FBA website within 24 hours. You can find the recording on the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. If you take a minute to do that, we would really appreciate your input. I'll pass it back to Gary now to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Thanks, Trish. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your vacation. So I appreciate you jumping in for us today.
No problem.
And good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, we heard from Joey Winder, the Director of the Capital Projects Fund with the U.S. Department of Treasury. And he discussed the Treasury's multi-billion-dollar investment in broadband. Joey, it was a fantastic session. He's such a great guy and so fun to talk with. And Treasury's about halfway through awarding its $10 billion broadband funding for fiber projects. So if you haven't applied, you better hurry up and apply because it's going quick. That brings us to today's Fiber Breakfast session with Jeff Heynen, the Vice President for Broadband Access and Home Network Market Research with Dell'Oro. Today's topic is fiber history in the making based on his most recent research. Now that the final numbers are in, Jeff is going to share with us just how big a year it was for fiber equipment purchases in the U.S. and what the future holds for new technologies, including 5 gig and 50 gig and 100 gig PON. Jeff joined Dell'Oro Group in 2018 and is responsible for broadband access and home networking market, fixed wireless infrastructure, and CPE market research programs. Jeff expanded the broadband access and home networking areas include fixed wireless, CPE, virtual CCAP, remote PHY, remote MAC-PHY. Cable has such great acronyms, DOCSIS 4.0 infrastructure. Jeff has written articles and white papers, and his research and analysis have been widely cited in leading trade and business publications. Jeff is a frequent expert judge, including at the Fiber Connect conference, and invited speaker, including Fiber Connect at conferences and events. So with that, welcome, Jeff. And for our audience, please type in your questions as we go, and we'll work them in the Q&A at the end. With that, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
All right, thanks, Gary. Always good to be a participant here and to share the numbers and just give you all context, give all your members and attendees a little bit of context for where the market is and where it's headed. So let's skip to the next slide, please. You know, last year, I think about this time, I was kind of giving a similar presentation on this forum, and we were talking about how big 2021 ended up being. Well, no doubt that 2022 was going to be equally big. I just didn't, and I don't think others expected it to be quite as big, certainly given what we were experiencing in the early stages with supply chain, labor constraints, and other things. However, really, it became clear throughout the early stages of 2022 that the demand for broadband, and in particular fiber broadband, really just kind of trumped where and really set a precedent over some of those difficulties that we saw. So what I'm showing here is just to give you some context about spending in the North American market from 2019 up to 2022, and you can see the step function increase in revenue and spend that we saw in 2022, an increase of 19%. Now, I've been an analyst for 17, 18 years at this point. And in a mature market like broadband, having multiple years of consistent year-on-year growth like that is very, very unusual. And so what that signals, obviously, and Gary, your members are seeing this too, I think, is just a commitment to spending and expansion projects, as well as overbuild projects to get more fiber into the ground. Well, these numbers here in aggregate represent all the cable access infrastructure, all those acronyms that Gary mentioned at the outset, and all the associated CPE for PON deployments, as well as cable, including DSL, although certainly DSL over this same time frame from 2019 to 2022 has seen a roughly $1.8 billion decline in terms of spending. And really, if I were to map the DSL spending and fiber spending in North America, you'd basically see that 1.8 billion shift from DSL spend over to fiber. So it's very clear that we've got overbuild going on as well as expansion. The other thing I'll mention here with this data from North America is that North America, the growth here is far outpacing what we've seen in other regions. And up until 2021, that was never really the case. So again, what that shows is a commitment by these operators to expand and get more fiber into the ground. Let's go to the next slide, please. With that commitment in terms of fiber, obviously, we're seeing tremendous increases in the amount of PON equipment that's being purchased to support that connectivity. In fact, OLT revenue was up 15% in 2022, and that was after a 73% growth in 2021, which is just extraordinary. So obviously, operators purchasing the equipment and the infrastructure and you know, the PON market is such that operators will buy the OLTs first, and then in subsequent quarters, you'll see the ONTs follow as they start to market the services that they have available in the regions, and then start to turn up subscribers by either doing the installs or sending them the ONTs for do-it-yourself installs. The other thing that's interesting here is that as we've had discussions with the equipment vendors as well as the operators, it's been pretty clear that the OLTs have been less impacted by the supply chain issues that we've seen. ONTs, in terms of subscriber connectivity, they do share, in some cases, components with a lot of consumer electronics. And you know, certainly in 2020 and 2021, those were the most difficult supply chains to reconstruct, whether due to just demand or whether due to fires at certain plants, manufacturing facilities that impacted subcomponents, capacitors, and things like that that go into the ONTs. So we're getting the sense that those supply chains are being rebuilt, and that availability certainly to map against subscriber growth, that the ONTs are going to be available for operators to purchase. Let's go to the next slide, please. The other thing I like to show, especially with respect to the North American market here, is just how much investment is being made in 10 gigabit capable technology, specifically XGS-PON. But I throw on here 10 gig EPON as well, because that is currently the technology that's in favor among cable operators. I certainly don't expect cable operators to stick with that. Certainly, however, right now, it's 10 gig EPON and DOCSIS provisioning over EPON makes it a lot easier for the cable operators to introduce those technologies as they migrate over to fiber gradually. It makes it easier to introduce from a management and provisioning perspective. Charter's RDOF-based edge-out projects, for example, are very heavily 10 gig EPON based. But I certainly expect over time that those same cable operators and smaller cable operators are already doing this now, that they will also move to XGS-PON to take advantage of the volumes and the scale deployments and price benefits that you get with those deployments. So let's go to the next slide, please. And I'm kind of going through these a little bit fast because I know we have a lot of questions, and I like to spend some time answering those questions as well, both on the telco fiber side as well as the cable side. So, you know, I mentioned at the outset that the ONTs were the ones that had been impacted most by the supply chain constraints, and we're certainly seeing that. You know, you look at how much investment has been made in the XGS-PON infrastructure, and you know, if you're thinking about a typical range of 24 to or 32 to 64 splits per OLT port, then certainly there should be a far larger number of ONTs in the marketplace at this point for XGS-PON, and that's just not the case. It's still ramping up, and certainly as operators complete their expansion and overbuild projects, as they begin to market services, we're going to continue to see heavy purchasing and heavy shipment volumes of those XGS units. And you can see the growth relative to the traditional 2.5 gig GPON units over the last few years. And I fully expect that in 2023, probably by the middle of this year, that at least in the North American market, that XGS units will surpass these 2.5 gig GPON units. Price points are coming down. I think that's an important part of it. And you know, keep in mind that for these XGS-PON units, they typically, even the bridge units, have either a 2.5 gig LAN port at a minimum, or even 10 gig LAN ports. So those certainly add a good percentage of cost to the overall bill of materials. So those price points are beginning to come down, making it more affordable for operators to buy these XGS-PON units in volume. So let's go to the next slide, please. So, you know, just as soon as we start to talk about XGS-PON and the deployments there, we're already beginning to see, in some cases, particularly in North America, the market being seeded by 25 gig capable ports. Now, I say that they're capable because really the percentage of these ports that have been actually turned on to deliver services, to deliver revenue generating services, is fairly limited at this point. Cost is an issue, of course. The ONT ecosystem is just not there yet. But I think it's important to note that you've got a growing number of cumulative OLT ports that are being put out into the network, so that operators that prefer this upgrade path have that flexibility to, if there's a competitive response, for example, with DOCSIS 4.0, they could light up these 25 gig ports and begin to offer symmetric 8 to 10 gig services if they want to. We know of some operators that obviously are doing that already today, using 25 gig for symmetric 10 gig services. Now it certainly seems a bit overkill for our needs as users today, but you know, time and time again, it has shown that if you give consumers the bandwidth, they will find ways to use it, even with improvements in video compression, and all of those things. There's a steady growth, a CAGR of anywhere from 25 to 35% consumption growth on the downstream side year over year, and that's not going to stop. So right now, these 25 gig ports, in our discussions with operators, are really being slated mostly for business services, but also potentially mobile transport applications, and certainly as time moves on, we'll see more and more of these be used for high-end residential services. So again, 10 gig or XGS-PON is really the technology of choice, I think, for this decade in terms of volume, and certainly 25 gig, and then we'll talk about 50 gig and 100 gig in a little bit, and what their roles are in the future. Next slide, please. So we mentioned cable operators, and I've shown this slide around in different forums, different venues. As a matter of fact, I shared it at the Cable Next Gen event last week out in Denver, and I think it ends up being a surprising number for many attendees and people that follow the market at just how many remote OLT ports that are specifically designed to fit into existing node housings or new node locations, obviously with a new node housing to support the power consumption and heat dissipation requirements. But cable operators aren't, they're not sitting idly by, and whether it's DOCSIS 4.0 for the larger operators or those smaller operators that have already overbuilt with fiber or are in the process of doing so, they are certainly responding and making investments in their own fiber infrastructure. And a lot of them are doing this through the use of remote OLTs, which allow them to, again, take advantage of their existing node locations, but then begin to peel off service groups, fiber service groups in maybe new neighborhoods from that existing node, where they might be still serving the existing neighborhoods with DOCSIS 3.0 or 3.1 services. So this is, for some operators, the node is their transition point from DOCSIS to fiber, and obviously we can have that debate as to how quickly that's going to happen. So next slide, please. So just kind of to wrap things up, I mean, clearly another record year for shipments. I'm not really seeing things at this point slowing down. Certainly, I think the growth rates in terms of overall purchasing are going to slow. They just have to. I mean, there is so much capacity that's already been put into the networks. There's going to be more capacity added, certainly, as these expansion and overbuild projects continue. But this year, I'm kind of expecting a mid to high single-digit growth rate for PON equipment, for example, for this year. So the BEAD projects, the ongoing Treasury Department funding, RDOF, all of these are still really funneling down and filtering down to the equipment vendors that I track specifically, and certainly they've mentioned what their estimates are for revenue that's accretive based on those projects, and so I think growth is expected for this year. As I mentioned, one thing that makes operators or helps operators feel more comfortable about this investment in fiber is the fact that the technology roadmap is extremely healthy. They've got a plan from, if they want to do 2.5 gig today, to 10 gig XGS-PON, to 25 gig, and now there's 50 gig and 100 gig technologies that are being worked on. And so this isn't there aren't concerns about regrettable spend or capital that's going to go to waste, because this roadmap is healthy. The vendor ecosystem is clearly very healthy. And it's pretty obvious that subscriber demand, in addition to that, is very healthy. So for the remainder of this decade, we do see that XGS-PON is going to be the volume technology for scaled residential services for this year. As I mentioned before, I think there will be some operators that will deploy 25 gig PON for residential services in situations where maybe they're in a very tight competitive environment and they want to differentiate themselves based on speed offerings. And they will continue to do that throughout this decade. And when it comes to some of the new technologies, 50 gig PON, for example, I'm looking at maybe volume deployments in late 2025, early 2026, but even potentially earlier in 2024 in China. And then, as we've seen over many iterations of PON technologies, as China has typically built out their networks, then the vendor ecosystem evolves from there. And certainly there's a lot of work being done on the standards. 50 gig is interesting because it integrates some new technologies, and certainly as you move to these higher speeds, but you're still operating within the same power budget, you have some concerns, and so that's why this technology is still being worked on. The introduction of DSPs, or digital signal processors, to ensure the signal quality. That's kind of a new piece to the overall PON equation. Traditional PON technologies have not integrated DSPs before, so that's a bit of a change, and I think operators are really going to want to test this technology out and make sure that it fits within their and doesn't impact their existing optical distribution networks whatsoever. And finally, just as we start to talk about 50 gig, we're already talking about 100 gig options, and there are already a number of those on the table, including, again, a DSP-based single wavelength option. And keep in mind that PON has traditionally, residential PON has traditionally been based on single wavelengths. The only variable there is NG-PON2, which Verizon has used. That uses a coherent, and also coherent technologies are under discussion for 100 gig and even potentially 200 gig speeds. So, coherent obviously introduces additional costs because you have multi-wavelengths, and certainly then you need ONTs to be able to distinguish between those wavelengths. But again, I think there are extremely smart people, standards bodies that are already working on developing these technologies, such that for the operators that are deploying fiber today, these technologies will be ready for them when they need to upgrade and when they choose to upgrade. So I think that wraps things up for my prepared slides.
Jeff, you always have such great information, and really interesting. So one of the things that kind of surprised me with your comment is that U.S. growth is outpacing other regions. I even saw that when Jamie was on from Omnia, that she even said that the U.S. is going to outpace China in PON growth, which who would ever thought that we could even compare with China on their deployment. But what's going on in the UK, Europe? I thought everybody post-pandemic would be deploying fiber like crazy. So why is the U.S. outpacing everybody else?
Well, certainly we are seeing now in the UK, BT OpenReach, also the altnets that have been pushing for fiber deployments there. Deutsche Telekom is really just beginning its process of moving over to fiber. So yeah, you've got a whole mix still of operators in the European market. I think the competitive environment over there is just a little bit different. Cable operators over there are not as committed, at least from my perspective, to DOCSIS 4.0. Many of them certainly are already at 1.2, but they're doing so with DOCSIS 3.1. Some have gone to high split, but that's where they're maxing out. And so in many cases, the competitive environment and the kind of war and threats that would drive you to invest more heavily are just not there. The other thing we have to factor in is that although there are subsidies in some countries that are available, they're certainly not there to the extent that they are here in the U.S. And certainly those are what are driving the significant investments here.
Yeah, I was just on a call yesterday. I'm going to be speaking in Madrid next month, and my panelists were talking. And who would have thought that Spain would have been, kind of the forefront of getting fiber out? And then also, who would have thought that Australia would be such a mess? But evidently, the political flip-flops have really kind of disrupted their deployments. But one of my buddies, George Nodder, he reported from SCTE, and I'm going to quote him. He says, "It's clear to us that nearly every cable operator is at the very least evaluating fiber. The vast majority of U.S. cable operators are applying for federal funding grants and describing fiber as the end game." But he notes that smaller cable operators have greater flexibility to overbuild themselves with fiber for several advantages than over the tier ones, because one, they're behind on 3.1 upgrades that is required for the path to DAA or operating DOCSIS 3.0. They also have smaller footprints to overbuild, and then they don't have these public shareholders that get unnerved by large CapEx projects. And then the competitive magnitude is less. And they're convinced that subscribers don't need or want 4.0. So what are you seeing? I mean, Jamie Linderman was telling us that, in 10 years, that all cable operators will be over, be on all fiber networks. Do you agree with that? And we're just debating the timing?
Well, I think all will have some degree of fiber in their networks. I don't expect that for the tier ones, given the path, the upgrade path, and the investment that the likes of Charter, Comcast, Cox, and others are going to go through here. And to your quoting of George Nodder there, I mean, I think he's right. I think certainly the smaller operators are doing what other smaller telcos are doing and taking advantage of the subsidy environment. And yeah, they absolutely have. Many of those have been at DOCSIS 3.0. Their outside plant has been at 750 megahertz. And so the leap to 1.2 or potentially 1.8, that's a significant cost. And if somebody, the federal government or state governments are going to subsidize your effort to move to fiber, why not take advantage of that now? So I think that's true. The scale of the tier ones and, I think makes that, and obviously the fact that they're publicly traded and have to answer to Wall Street and their investors, I think that makes for a big difference as to why they're following the DOCSIS 4.0 path. I think it's, I'm an analyst that covers all these technologies, so I think it's important to note that DOCSIS 4.0 introduces, and the upgrade to DOCSIS 4.0 introduces new technologies in the outside plant that make it more reliable, HFC more reliable, and competitive with fiber offerings. Maybe not on the upstream side or for symmetric speeds, but certainly in terms of reliability. Maybe not in terms of operational costs, but again, in terms of reliability, latency, it can be competitive. So I say that not to wave the flag of cable, but also just to say that, there's a bandwidth war, of course, and it's not just going to be a bandwidth war. It's going to be how you package your services, how you package a combination of latency and upstream speed, if that customer knows that, how you handle the home networking environment. These are going to be the things that differentiate services and, help operators who have now these fantastic fiber networks continue to remain sustainable with subscriber growth and revenue.
Well, Jeff, we've got a ton of questions, so I'm going to need you to follow up on some of these questions afterwards. But I do want to sneak in one. Do you see any changes in government policy on the horizon that could accelerate broadband, like permitting and streamlining permitting, or slowing down deployment, such as like net neutrality if we get a fifth commissioner?
I'm not seeing that. What I'm seeing now is efforts to accelerate the BEAD funding process, and I've certainly I'm hopeful that that happens so that the states that are ready to start distributing these funds, the ISPs, can do so. The other thing I think is important is maintaining the ACP, the Affordable Connectivity Plan. Because we talk about the technologies here, but bridging the digital divide isn't just a technology question, it's an affordability question. So we need to make sure that people can get connected and stay connected.
Yeah, 100% with you on that. Well, Jeff, always love having you. Really appreciate you joining us, and really appreciate your work, your research, and industry insights. Yeah, I did share with you a lot of people yesterday when I saw your chart on how much cable is deployed in fiber. It was kind of a shocking. We knew it was a lot, but didn't know it was that huge. So anyway, very interesting. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. We're going to be discussing electric co-op broadband, why make ready matters, with Finley Engineering's senior consultant Ryan Kududra. I probably said that wrong, as he discusses the broadband opportunities, including pole infrastructure, participation, and the key ingredients, what he calls the pancake mix for electric co-ops. So we'll see you guys next Wednesday. And again, thanks, Jeff. We really appreciate it, and we'll see if we can follow up on all these questions we didn't get to.
All right, thanks, Gary. Appreciate it.